she can kick us all off. Okay. Kirsty, you'd like to take the frame? It's yours.
Requested that I can share my screen, but you have to approve it.
I think I've done it now.
Thank you. Okay. So I was just going to talk about UX as part of development. So who am I? I've been working in the digital industry for the last 15 years. I first started working out as a business analyst, and then I moved to project management about 11 years ago. I'm a certified Scrum Master and a certified Kanban team practitioner. So what does a PM do? I make sure the project's delivered, basically. I make sure it's delivered to time, budget and scope. I ensure that the team know what's expected of them. So if you're ever put onto a project, I make sure that you understand what the expectation is of you. And I make sure that everyone on my team is happy. I own the project process. So in terms of how you're going to be working with the client, how you're going to be working with the other team members is directed by myself. I'm commercially aware, so that obviously if you're on a project, someone has to pay for your time. So I make sure that you're aware of that limitation, how much time you've got. I report the project status to the client and internally, and I deal with any issues that might happen on the project. So the project life cycle, starting off, you usually go to sales. Well, I've always worked in a industry and agency environment, so that I've always got an end client that pays the bill. We don't just have an endless amount of time that you can spend on the project. The client's paying for it. So we always have a sales part of the project, then initiation, then planning, execution, and development and delivery. Where I see UX coming into it is more planning and execution rather than just, but not towards the end, as mainly development.
I think what's really interesting there that you're talking about, Kirsty, from a budgeting point of view, is when you do some UX things, the amount of times I've worked with a team and UXers and designers, you get a bit egotistical, and if they haven't got much experience with working with developers or at the end of the project, they can get a bit too carried away with what they're doing. And sometimes you have to go, well, we could do better solutions, because of course you can always do something better, but sometimes you've just got to do what's good enough to get the next stage of the project unblocked so everyone else can start working correctly. And that's an important part to make in when you're looking at things like budgets.
Yeah. So there's 3 types of projects that I've worked on. The more traditional type is waterfall. Waterfall is that everything is set into clear phases and you don't start another phase until the first phase is complete. So design, both UX design, UI design, writing specifications all happens up front. And then once that's signed off, the developers start at that point. They don't start before everything's signed off. Then you test it after the development's complete, and then you go live.
What do you find is the pros and cons of this sort of waterfall thing, Kirsty?
So the pros of it is that the scope is defined and everything's defined up front before you go into build. Mm. It's good for smaller projects because smaller in terms of duration and cost, because it'll only work if stuff isn't likely to change. So you can actually do everything up front. But if it's a large project and you're trying to write the specifications all up front and do the designs all up front, it can take months, years even, for it to actually go live, and there will be a lot of change within that process. And by the time you've gone through that duration, what the client said they wanted a year ago, it might not be fit for purpose in a year's time. So that's the reason that the industry's been moving away from waterfall.
So this is kind of good for smaller fixed scope projects then?
Yes.
Yeah. Cool.
And if a client wants to make a change, it's a formal process. So you usually have to sign off formal documentation. it's always going to cost them more money. And there's always a record of it, and it's very formal in their approach. Agile is centred around minimum viable product, MVP. And I've always used Scrum and Kanban, which I'm about to talk about in more detail.
What would you say? Oh, I was about to ask what MVP was. There you go, straight onto it.
Yeah. So MVP, it's about not always creating bespoke code, using native features where possible, and questioning what is MVP and trying to reduce scope. So from your perspective on a UX point of view, it's making sure that you're designing for the system that has been sold in. So for example, if you're working on a known CMS, such as Magento, try and work within the limitations of that platform. If you're creating something whereby the developers have to go and write code and it's not something that comes as standard, it's going to cost more money.
Okay, so Magento sort of comes, I suppose, out of the box, as a term we've often used. If Magento comes out of the box, so, okay, well, this is the template you can put your website onto. Every change of that template that we might recommend from a UX point of view has got to be development, that's got to be tweaked and changed, because you've got to change the template, which means that incurs costs. Is that correct?
Yes.
Right, cool. So again, trying to design, sometimes when the budget's minimal, you basically try and almost at times try and reskin a template as close to it as possible, because that means that there's going to be less money in cost in development. It's going to trim the deadline down, and a lot less scope for mistakes, of course, because once you start breaking things and playing around with code, you can open up a can of worms if you're not careful.
Yeah.
Cool.
And a good example of this is a checkout. A checkout, Magento, for example, they would have spent a lot of time investing into what the best user journey is. And if you're trying to hack that and change it, there's going to be a lot of testing going on to make sure that that's going to work.
Yeah.
Whereas if it was the standard native features that are out of the box, Magento's already tested that. They know it already works. So it's obviously going to cost the clients a lot less money.
Exactly. I think that, and again, it's another good lesson. It's sometimes, it pays as a designer to try and get yourself familiar with certain templates and certain platforms, like Kirsty mentioned Magento, for example. So if you ever work on a project, you can sit in a meeting with the client and instantly what the latest Magento release, what their checkout looks like. So you can know from the project you're picking up if the Magento checkout will work. It might not do. It might not work for what the sort of product is. So then that's when you got to start working with developers and not making promises up front that will ruin a project later down the line.
Yeah. And then Scrum. Scrum is something that you'd have to work with when you're working on a project. It's the limitation of it's the process of how you'd work with the team, the client, and everyone within the business. Scrum are usually 2 weeks in length. You have a daily stand-up. So what you do in a daily stand-up is you're trying to communicate progress of where the project's up to. So each team member goes round and each person speaks and says what they've achieved yesterday, what they plan to achieve today, and if they've got any blockers. By blockers, it means anything that's stopping you doing your work. So for example, if you need brand guidelines and you haven't been sent any, yeah, that's blocking you from doing your work. Any blockers, it's the job of myself or someone else within the team to try and remove those blockers and get that information from the client.
And when you say daily standard, how long will these meetings last for? Because instantly looking and think, oh God, that can take a day. One of these a day is going to take up a lot of my production time.
15 minutes.
Okay.
So for Scrum, it's time boxed to 15 minutes and shouldn't be any longer than that. Everyone should go through as quickly as possible. I hate the way it does actually say, Scrum says what you achieved, where it should actually say what you did. And the difference between that is I had someone, a developer once on my project with Asperger's, and I didn't know he had Asperger's, and he said to my client that yesterday I achieved nothing. What he meant by that was he didn't solve the problem he was trying to solve in the code. So it was a bug that he was trying to fix that he didn't fix. So he achieved nothing. That client was paying us time and materials. So they were paying us for his day's work trying to solve that problem. And the way he phrased it, they come with questioning me then, why have I paid for that day? So you just need to be careful as well, your terminology. Say what you actually did. Don't say that you didn't achieve anything. So he did achieve something. He spent a day going through, checking to see if it was, see what the causes were. He could have explained what he did, and that wasn't the problem. That hasn't solved the problem, and he still needed to do further investigation. But what he actually said to them was, yesterday I achieved nothing. These different ways of phrasing something.
And I think that's an interesting point again as well, is particularly in Scrum, when you do have these meetings, they're often designed to be quite transparent for clients. So clients can see that you don't just wander off for 2 weeks and just run up a massive bill and then just chuck some work at them. The idea is the client can see the progress, and it's a way of keeping everyone honest. But with that comes a responsibility to actually make sure you're speaking correctly in front of the client and you're not saying you did nothing. For example, like Kirsty said, they could have said, I really worked hard on this problem, blah, blah, blah. I think we might have to go and look at it, and because all these problems have come out of it. So you actually investigate, you actually are unearthing problems is what you should have said, but it comes out when you did nothing. So that's always an interesting point, that we have to remember that you've got to be careful how you speak to the clients and how you present to them, because eyes are always on you. And if you say something, you might think, it's a bit casual, but then Kirsty, the PM, gets it in the neck from the client, and I can wager as soon as the client puts the phone down, you're going to get it in the neck from Kirsty. So, always the sort of things you've got to be mindful
of. There's another session called backlog grooming session, which is done by the product owner. The product owner is the client. The client has someone on their side that acts as the we say the owner of the product. So they make all of these decisions about the product. They say whether something needs to be done this way or that way, and they know the full requirements of what it's supposed to achieve. They prefer the use of stories. They set the user priorities, add acceptance criteria, and ensure it's small enough for the developers to pick up. You might be pulled into these type of meetings as well, from a design perspective, to explain your designs, so that the BA knows what to write the acceptance criteria based.
So what just for people that aren't familiar, what do you mean as a backlog? What does a backlog actually mean? How does that manifest itself?
It's a list of requirements of the system. Okay. So you might get, for example, one user story could be, as a user, I want to be able to check out using my credit card so that I can pay for a product and the business gets money. That's the type of requirements that you see in a backlog.
Got it. And you'd have a list of all these requirements, and these requirements would get prioritized and, as you say, groomed and worked out what is easier to do, harder to do, all these sort of things. And then is it those criteria that goes into, okay, which ones those criteria now push them into the next sprint? Is that what basically how it works? Or
yes and no.
I was going to say, I've got it wrong for the last 8 years probably. But.
Yeah, it is. It's yes and no. So it can be based upon what is the cheapest, what is the easiest to do, but it's also what is the higher priority to the client. So some clients just doesn't matter that it's going to take a big chunk of their work, they still want it to be done. What we try to do as a development team is make sure the harder to implement stuff is done first, so that you understand the limitations of where you're up to, and understand there's no nasty surprises, so that or any risks on the project are tackled first, and you're left with clean sailing stuff near the end of the project.
Right, and I suppose if you are doing something like an MVP, as you've just spoken about a minute ago, sometimes some things on the list actually of the backlog won't actually even make it to MVP, because you realise actually I can do without them, so they'd get lower priority. That's a fair call.
Correct, and also the same with acceptance criteria as well. So something that might be on a design might not make it into the end product because it might be deemed that we don't actually need it. So that's usually written out in the story, and it might come back at a later date.
Cool.
Then we have a demo, which I've said it's demoing real code, but in your instance, you'd still do a demo, and you'd be showing off where you're up to with your wireframes or your user stories. Or
right, yes, yeah. So we've had this. There's the stories that's been taken into the sprint. Let's say 2 or 3 of them would apply to me or you guys. you would work on those, and you'd give, in your daily stand-ups, you'd give feedback and explain what you've done and what you've achieved. And by doing that every day, everyone will know, everyone will know what to expect after the 2-week sprint of what you're going to present, because it's been very transparent. And so you do some sort of like I said, demo presentation, whether it's a prototype, it depends whatever it is really, or whatever the agreement is with the client. Ideally you want to try, and you've also got to do that in line with the developers. You've got to make sure that what you are prototyping, of course, you've got to make sure the developers have a look at it the day before you show them. Or even a couple of days beforehand, because if you demo something they haven't seen, and all of a sudden you're demoing something the platform just can't cater for, then you're in big trouble, because the client wants it and they can't have it, and you just show them they can have it. Then it gets a nightmare. And again, this is all about how we as UXers and UX and UI designers sit in the whole ecosystem of a project. We have to be really careful what we recommend and suggest, because we can cock up an entire project by not talking to people, not being transparent. Cool.
There's also retrospectives, and retrospectives are again done every 2 weeks. It's a point to celebrate success, to give everyone a pat on the back and say, Giles has done this for me in the last 2 weeks. It's the first time anyone's ever done that to me. It's brilliant. The designs are perfect, type of thing. But it's also for continuous improvement. So if someone's not doing something that they should be doing, or you've seen an opportunity to improve the process, this is where you bring that up. You're just trying to get better in each iteration. Sprint planning, you review the user stories which the BA and the product owner has prepared. It's a chance to go through, say that you understand what you're meant to be working on, you understand what the outcome is meant to be, and it can be testable if it was a development piece of work. And in Scrum, you're making a commitment. So what you're doing after sprint planning is you're going through and you're going to be estimating how much that piece of work is going to take. And then at the end of it, you come back to me as the project manager, and I'd look at the capacity of the team, and then I'd tell the client, you're going to get this list within the next 2 weeks. The team think that this is what they can achieve, and that's what you're trying to get to by the end of that 2 weeks. Whereas Kanban, lean Kanban's a little bit different. You work in 1 week iterations usually, can be 2, but 1 week usually. You have daily syncs that are sort of like stand-ups, but they're not. They're usually again around 15 minutes, but they're not actually time boxed. They can go on as long as it takes, basically. The difference between it is you walk a board. So I don't know if you're familiar with Jira or not, but it's usually a Jira board, but it can be an actual physical board like Giles has got in the back of him. It basically just says what's to do, what's in progress, what's in QA, etc., etc. And you walk through saying what from the done column, anything that's moved to done yesterday, anything that's with the client, etc., etc. So everyone understands where you're up to, and you only go through 1 day's worth of work. You're trying to get the same information as what you was out of Scrum in terms of what's being achieved, what someone going to be working on today, and is there any blockers.
It's a fascinating process, Kanban. I really enjoyed learning about it, and fundamentally the idea of Kanban is to sort of limit what's in the work in progress column and keep moving the jobs across the board from, let's say there's your backlog, there's today, there's work in progress, or just keep pushing them into a done column as fast as possible, and trying to break down tickets. It's a good way of working a project. I really like working in Kanban, and you find it very useful in a lot of UX problems, not just for development. It's great just to solve various problems in UX, whether you're doing user testing and feedback to the results and all these sort of things. It lays out a project nice and cleanly. It doesn't overwhelm you. It makes all the tickets bite-sized and easy to work with. I'm a big fan of it, actually. I really enjoyed it. And what project did you work on the Kanban where it worked quite well, Kirsty? Remember?
I've worked on a few where it's worked quite well, to be honest.
Okay.
The most recent one, Talk Mobile, that one was Kanban.
Right.
Yeah, BFBS, Kanban. Most of the projects we've been on lately are Kanban.
Yeah, BFBS has delivered quite well actually. They're happy with that. Great, cool.
The main difference between Scrum and Kanban is for Scrum, you're trying to get a group of tickets that you've made a commitment on for the next 2 weeks, all done by the end of the sprint. In Kanban, you're trying to get each individual ticket across the board and to done as fast as possible. So it's not a group of tickets, it's one ticket as fast as possible. Whereas, yeah, Scrum, you're trying to get all of them done by a certain amount of time. Backlog agreement is pretty much the same thing as it was with Scrum. The only difference is you're trying to get the tickets the same size. So for Kanban, you don't estimate tickets. You try and get them at the same size and they're done as fast as possible within the same time, so you can recognise how much time it's taken through how much work is being complete. Again, you have weeklies, which is a demo, you review the risks, you do retrospective and planning, but there's no commitment made, no task breakdown. The team don't select the tickets that they're going to deliver. You just keep picking from the top of the backlog. So that's the main difference between the two. So where does a UX designer fit in? They're the foundation of the project. They're the ones that put the thought into how the project's going to be developed. So obviously they don't give the developers information in terms of how they're going to code it, but they're making sure that the user journey is being thought out. You've started some basic wireframes, you've thought about the interactions from the user perspective. Normally on agile projects, the back end work starts at the same time as you're on the project. So we do stuff called Sprint Zero. Sprint Zero is setting up the environments to start developing on. So it'll be making sure that they've got their local development environment set up. It'll be setting up the testing sites, etc. And they'll start on stuff that doesn't actually need design work to work on. So an example of that is integrations with a third-party system. If your integration with a third-party system, you have to do it in a certain way. It's not relied upon designs, and the back-end developers will start work on that while you're starting the design work.
So an example of that might be like an e-commerce website who has to integrate with some sort of delivery system that the company owns. Okay, cool.
Yeah. So the delivery system it'll be the back-end warehousing system for a mobile phone platform. It'll be your My Account section and the minutes, etc. Because that information, it's a standalone system that you have to go to a third party for, and it doesn't need designs.
During this Sprint Zero, as a UXer, we would be doing the foundation work of the project, because obviously when you go into Sprint 1, you need to have some work ready to start to pass on to the developers to actually do tangible stuff. You will have a team of front-enders, for example, ready to start working on some bits and bobs. So during the Sprint Zero, this is when there'll be some other development work going on in the background that doesn't involve us at all.
Yeah.
Right.
Usually what we try to do is a UX person would be on for 2 weeks. Something could be signed off. A UI would be coming onto the project 2 weeks later. Yeah. And then a front-end developer would be coming on 2 weeks later. Yeah. So you're trying to get, not everything's going to be signed off all in one go, but you're passing each other enough information, enough pieces of work so that it'll go through the whole system, so that everything gets enough work.
So more likely then that the front end team would be coming in sort of Sprint 3 maybe.
Yes.
After the UI team of put work in Sprint 2 based on Sprint 1's UX recommendations. I get it.
Yep. So what would I expect from a UX designer, as a project manager? I'd expect you to attend meetings on time. I'd expect you to update your timesheets daily.
If you don't update your timesheets, your PM will come down here like a ton of bricks. Kirsty certainly has done a few times. Actually, explain why that's really important, please. That's I think.
Yeah, the reason that's really important to attend meetings on time is you don't want the client waiting around and asking why they're getting billed for your time when you're late. Secondly, the updating the timesheet. Most companies will send out either weekly, 2-weekly or monthly invoicing to the client. And if your timesheet information is not up to date, we might send out the invoices incorrectly and not invoice them enough information. I've had to go back to a client once and say, I'm sorry, such and such didn't do the timesheet. I'm missing £4,000 worth of work. We need to charge you an extra £4,000. Obviously, they're not very happy in that instance, and it'd be avoided if people update the timesheet. We're not trying to do this to make sure that what you're doing all day, every day, it's literally for invoicing. We're invoicing the client the information. I'd expect you to create scope estimations. It's not done purely by one person usually. There's some sort of peer review, and it's usually a senior designer that do it initially.
So a good example of this, Kirsty mentioned a project earlier, BFBS. So I was working with a midweight designer, Owen, and I helped him, say, okay, how long are you going to take on this? How long will this take? And we had to understand the criteria of the next steps and the outlines of the phases, and we worked together, and I was able to get that out of him and passing on, letting him work. He then learned how to start to scope projects as well. So it's something ideally that as you work your way through junior to midweight to senior, you'll pick up these kind of skills. And sometimes it can be quite daunting thinking you've got to come up with some estimations, but there's all sorts of simple ways you can do things. There's a t-shirt sizing idea, for example, of just going what's going to take a small or medium or a large amount of time, and then you can just appropriate very, very generic terms around that. You might say small is half a day, mediums 1 day, large is 2 days, or large is 3 days, or something like that. And all of a sudden you can rattle through a scope and go, yeah, small, that's medium, that's large, that's large, that's large, that's large. And then at the end you go, okay, just about this amount of days. And then you can start to chip away at it and mold it a little bit, and then pass it on to Kirsty, for example, who will then say, okay, well, let's give a range to the client. And then you kind of starting to get somewhere. So that's quite an interesting part of the phase, and something you'll learn as you go along. So, Kirsty, off you go.
And then the next one was work within the agreed estimations. So if Giles has said a homepage is going to take 2 days, if it's given to you and you think it's going to take you 3, say something with about that time, because that's going to cost the client more money. But someone's going to have that conversation. That someone would be me. So I'd rather have that conversation early. So if it's going to be 2 days, if it's going to be 3, just make sure that you're working within the estimations. And if you don't agree with it, flag it straight away. Flag that as an issue so that it can be dealt with. Flag any changes as well. So Giles would have estimated it and said, this is based upon X, Y, Z. If the client's then asking you for X, Y, Z and plus A, B, C, tell me that you're being asked to do more than what was estimated. So that again, I can go back to the client and tell them this is why it's going to cost them more money. As Giles was pointing out before, work with a front-end developer. Don't just do designs by yourself, because if they can't build it, then your designs are useless. So make sure that you're working with the front-end developer so they can tell you if it's possible.
Particularly on that bit as well is in responsive templates, and particularly in e-commerce websites, which can have a lot of complex information. If you think of like a product page with all the price points and the offers and little reviews and that sort of thing, when the screen sizes and screens the browser windows go smaller and bigger, you've got to think how things stack, think how things move on a page. Now, if you don't understand properly how a template will move the information, you could design something that actually might take the developer 2 days more to make it move how you want it to move when it goes to mobile. But if you work with them, and they can say, actually, that layer will be there and that layer will be there, you can actually change the designs so it's much more user-friendly, or much more developer-friendly, so and budget-friendly. Those sort of things are really important to learn.
And on the flip side of that, by speaking to the front-end developer, if it's something that the client really wants, it's going to increase their estimation. You need to tell them at that point, this design that I'm doing is going to cost you more development effort, rather than just sending it to the development team and them having to say, actually, that design is going to cost you more money, because they would have estimated their work up front as well, based upon some assumptions. So if your work's then impacting their estimations, it's good that everyone's on the same page. And asking for help when needed. Asking for help, that's nothing. Sitting on something for a day and costing a client money, that really annoys me. But if you say to me, I don't know what I'm doing, I need help with this, I can get you help. That's fine. There's no problem with asking for help. But just trying to do it yourself and not being able to do it and wasting money is literally the most irritating thing in the world. But asking for help it's something that it's so easy. We can get you any help that you want. Just don't try and do it by yourself if you can't do it.
And a lot of these sites can be thoroughly complex things. Not everyone's expected to understand every aspect of it when you're working on it. There's often something that will come up, but there's often something that if you ask for help on something, you can be unearthed very quickly. Actually, that's part of the project that hasn't been scoped out. No one's actually asked that question. Interesting, you found that. We have to deal with that. If you sit on it, like Kirsty said, it just becomes worse and worse and worse because eventually that problem will get found out at some development phase. It will cost them a shitload more money, basically, to undo it and undo all the designs and go backwards. And so it's often very good. We're the eyes and ears of the initial stages of these projects, and it's important for us to think along those lines and not be afraid to ask tricky questions and not be afraid to ask for help if you don't understand something.
Yeah, and then my last point is usually you're booked not just at the start of the project, but you're booked for a small amount of time through the whole project life cycle until the project goes live, so that anything that you haven't designed and thought of, the team can come back to you and ask you questions and say, this part of it, we need it to do what, to do X, what do you think should happen here? And you can have those conversations. You might mock up a new wireframe, or you might do something for it. Some of that time would have been planned within the project, and you are still involved. You're not just throwing it over the fence like you would in a waterfall project.
And that is, at that point, is a really important one from UX designers. What I've talked about quite a lot about creating good design systems, and sort of might be pattern libraries. There's lots of expressions out there, style guides, whatever. So what you can do, you effectively, once you come off a project and people are still developing it, they've got some sort of catalog system that says this is what a rollover state looks like. This is what a tertiary call to action button looks like. Here's the heading hierarchies. They understand all these things, so they can actually work it out for themselves. That's an important part of a project, is coming up with not just putting a load of designs on Sketch and firing it over. We have to make sure these stuff's documented correctly from a designer, so people can use it when you're not around. You might go on holiday for 2 weeks, for example, and you could really block some people up, and the designs that a front ender could come up with to present when there's not a designer on the project could actually really annoy a client because it doesn't look as good as it was looking, and it could start to go off the rails. So part of our responsibility is to make sure that you create a watertight environment, so when you come off a project, you can keep running smoothly.
And one point I've just thought of that I haven't put on this list, but it's probably worth mentioning, is often you're in external client Slack channels and internal client Slack channels. If a client asks a question and asking it towards the developer and you've got an opinion of it, speak in the internal channel, not in the external channel. I've had one person, that Giles probably knows what I'm talking about, and the client asked the developer a question. He's weighed it in from a UX point of view, and if we put what he's suggesting at that point in the project, it cost the client a lot more money. What he was saying was absolutely right, but it's not the time and the place to be saying it. Have that conversations internally. We can go back and speak to the client in a more formal approach, rather than it just being a Slack conversation and it looks like what we've developed is incorrect. It's just the way that it's being presented to the client, not the information that's being discussed.
Right.
And that's it. Any questions?
Brilliant. Thank you, Kirsty. Much appreciated. Or just shows that I'm going to the gallery view again. That was really good. Really, that's interesting to look at that and think what I've actually been involved in for the last 6 to 8 years. Good having your point of view. So, like Kirsty says, has anyone got any questions I'd like to ask at all, or anything at all? The floor's open. She's here for you to have any responses. Putting everyone on the spot.
How many will be in a team usually for a client project?
It depends how fast they want the development to be built. So for the BFBS project that I was on, there was 2 designers. I think there was 1 UX person. There was 4 back-enders, 3 front-enders, 1 QA, and myself, plus a client service representative. So
Fairly good sizable team there, isn't it?
mm-hmm.
So you can see pretty quickly that if we as UXers make a wrong, you've Kirsty's outlined there the areas that we are intrinsically involved in. So if we make a wrong call, well, let's say not a wrong call, but if we do something incorrect, then it's up to us to immediately flag that and try not to do things obviously incorrect, because it can have huge ramifications. And some of these websites we're talking about, they're £500,000. Some of these things are. It's not your average WordPress sort of stuff, you know. That's because development costs so much to do. Because a lot of people grinding out a lot of gnarly code, and if we don't ensure that they're actually developing the right thing, then we're in a bit of trouble. And it's interesting, Kirsty said there was a couple of designers and a UXer, you know, so, you know, people always say UX, UI design, that sort of thing. I suppose I'm a little bit of a hybrid of both of them, but some people are sort of specialists in terms of research. And I think it was Elena was working on BFBS, wasn't she? Yeah, and she was very good at very solid research, great at playing stuff back, and some of the stuff she did really fed brilliantly into our wireframes. She worked very closely with Owen to provide the wireframes. I worked with Owen to provide a lot of the UI and evolve some of the wireframes, and I said I was across the project as well. So when you're on a holiday, I could pick it up and keep things ticking over because of that seamless nature of it as well. But you know, if we don't get all this stuff done robustly and correctly, within budget, within estimates, then you can actually have quite a knock-on effect, particularly if it gets to QA and they start pushing tickets back, because then that all of a sudden affects the whole chain of people. That could be quite problematic.
One thing that's probably worth mentioning as well is the company Giles and I work for, we're used to having people work on projects full time once they're allocated and they jump to work on anything else. So when you're doing designs, you're on it for, depends on the size of the project, a couple of weeks full time, and then maybe half a day or so every 2 weeks or so. Whereas in other agencies, you might not be on a project full time. You might be asked to do a day here and a day there, which obviously is, it takes longer to then implement a project. Whereas we've always preferred to put everyone on the project, get that done, get it out the door, and then start a new project. Not just make sure that there's multiple projects trying to happen at the same time, and then all projects take longer. So that's the reason that a lot of clients would come to Invika. It's because that we have the capacity to have as many people on as possible and get it out the door as fast as possible.
You said obviously what you expect of a UX person, Kirsty, but what do you think? People are obviously different in companies in terms of tend to be what their personalities are with regards to what their job does. Very often, you know, as a PM, you're quite forthright, and you know, and that's what I expect as a PM. Developers can be quite very good at what they do, but at times, like you say as well, not great sometimes in front of clients. What sort of, I suppose if we're talking soft skills, what sort of soft skills do you look for in a good UX designer?
I expect them to know the subject knowledge, so that if the client asks them, what do you think in this scenario? Why should a user do this? I'd expect you to be able to say, according to this research or whatever, this is the best way to do it. So you're a point of knowledge in any given conversation, and the client gets that trust from you rather than just, why have they put that there? Why is this user journey? Who says that? You need some sort of thinking to have gone into it. I always use the example of some clients that me and Giles haven't even worked on, because me and Giles used to sit desk-wise pretty much next to each other. I'd be on calls and I'd be like trying to explain to a client a point, they wouldn't get it, and I'd just be like, Giles, have you got 5 minutes? And I go and grab a meeting room, and as we're walking into the meeting room, I'd give him 2 minutes of what I want him to do, and he'd be able to convince the client of my point and get it across. So it's just given that the confidence and the knowledge. I think confidence sometimes can outweigh the knowledge. If the client thinks you know what you're talking about, they'll accept what you're talking about is right.
I think a lot of that comes from experience as well. As a designer, if you have your own I suppose, your own value set, your own outlook on the design world, and your own preference of how you do things. You can normally, when you're brought into that sort of situation Kirsty's talking about, you basically just got to sit there and listen and take in as much information as you can for the first couple of minutes, ask any intelligent questions, understand that you've not been in there very long, so you're not going to immediately come up with something phenomenal, but then just apply it to your knowledge and your expertise. And if you don't allow yourself to be overawed in a situation like that, well, then you can, like Kirsty say, convince people very quickly, or you can just appease the client and at the very least take a bit of pressure out of the situation and buy the whole team a bit more time to work something out, and also get you involved. And if you do it confidently, then the clients tend to want to have you on the team a little bit more, which is really useful. So that's where it's so important as a designer to understand what makes you tick as a designer. Understand, and then when you bring that to the table, you talk about it confidently. Like I talk a lot about empathy, and I talk a lot about understanding people, and that gives me confidence to go into a meeting. Other people will talk about other things. They might talk about research initiatives or what have you, and someone else might talk about the power of transitions or all this sort of stuff. Everyone can talk about different things, but as long as you can make sure that you are presenting confidently in that situation, and that will always be a big plus for the team. So that's an important skill to learn, that is.
Exactly.
Has anyone else got anything they'd like to ask or share or discuss? Dave, I've seen you see your mouth moving a couple of times, but you end up being quiet, so I'm guessing you're thinking of something, but you can't.
I'm trying to. I did a agile course actually via LinkedIn, growing agile. I think South African or New Zealand firm. I really enjoyed it. It's just it makes sense, complete sense to me, with the short bursts of kind of activity and getting that dialogue across, getting the ideas across, rather than a prolonged meeting. I've been in meetings for years, and you end up falling asleep. But these seem like a really good idea of how to create something, how to develop as a team. I quite find it's quite exciting for me. I think you've given us a great deal of knowledge tonight as well, how you work in a UX perspective, which I've not really heard before. So that's been quite exciting. What else can I say? It's been really interesting. Yeah, thank you.
Actually, you brought a good push on, Katie. Yeah.
Just for Giles and Kirsty, for us that are career switching and who have never worked in agile, I'm from a corporate background. At the bare minimum, is it just expected within interviews to understand the different concepts of how you work and of how Kirsty's just explained? Because if you've never worked in them, it's a totally new concept. So certainly for on the interview perspective and things, is it just expected that you're aware of what happens in each style of meeting?
One reason why I was keen to bring Kirsty in today is because in my experience in the last month, 2 months, I've been looking for a job. I've noticed a lot of job descriptions, it could be the level I'm going in at, but a lot of the job descriptions have said understanding experience in agile, scrum, that sort of stuff. Because as a small senior member of a project team, you will be influencing the cadence of a project at a much higher level. You won't just be sitting there as a recipient for it all. But I would imagine as a career switcher going in, I didn't know anything about agile when I joined Invica at all. I learned about it and you kind of learn as you go along. And again, like Kirsty said, as a junior, when you're scoping stuff out, you'll be working with someone who's making the calls for you. You'll often have someone on a project, a senior. Well, you will always have someone senior on a project who will be guiding you through that, and you'll be learning. Because also agile is one of those words where if done purely, it can be really good, but it can also be done a bit dirtily and a bit sloppily at times. So I think, having a basic understanding of it. I mean, there's there's a load of blogs and simple things out there you can read that will give you a good overview. And if you want, you can flick through a book that can be you get some quite small books. And you're talking about, and then when you know enough about it. Again, if you get to an interview and someone does ask you about it, no one would expect to know because you're a junior basically, and you say, "Well, I know about agile, I know," blah, 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 and then they might say, "Oh, that's interesting." But then when you get brought into their industry, they'll probably do agile slightly differently to another company anyway. So I mean, it's just important to know the basic premise of it. I think so it's going to help you.
And if you tell the project manager that you need a guide, they'll be happy to go over this information with you. So I've done it to a lot of people that I've joined in Invica. Especially people on my projects or even in the Liverpool office. So how myself and Giles have worked is in Vicar, I've got offices across the UK, 8 in the UK, in Germany, in Hungary. So you're not usually on the project with just people that you're co-located with. So I'd usually just talk people through the process, and everyone in the Liverpool office had no problem with coming over to me and asking me if they were unsure of how to do anything. I'd be happy to help, just talk them through it, help them with user stories and understanding of what was expected of them. But always ask the project manager if you're unsure of anything, because they're the people that should be telling you of the boundaries to work within the process.
In fact, the most problem I've had was getting to grips with the software that's used to do Agile. We used something called Jira, and that was just a thoroughly complex piece of kit, and it always confused me. But often clients will have that problem as well. They might be familiar with Agile, and they might have asked for Agile to be in a project. That's why they might have picked you as a company, because you work in an Agile way. But they will need upskilling and working on the system, on Jira itself, because they might not be familiar with it. So then you kind of got some leeway, because you're sort of learning a little bit as much as they are, and your team will always support you and will always help you, because you're going in at a certain level. If I wandered in tomorrow and said, oh, I know all about Agile, and I went in tomorrow and I clearly knew nothing about Agile because I'm going in at a senior level, yeah, people probably will be very sympathetic with me. But certainly as career switching, going in a more junior level, it wouldn't be a problem at all. You wouldn't be put on the spot or exposed to a client, and like I say, the team around you would help you. But it would pay to have a little bit of knowledge around it a bit more. You can look back on this, or I say just grab a couple of blogs or a few PDFs and what. There's loads floating around the internet. Cool. Anyone else?
I can pop that link in the Slack channel if you want. It was a free course. It was I think it took me about a week of evenings. It wasn't much, but it was.
Pop it in, mate. Pop it in the Slack channel. That'd be great.
Yeah. And I got a little certificate at the end, which is always good to have a certificate on you.
Suppose you have it on the wall behind you, Dave.
Well, yeah, planning to. Yeah. Frame it.
That'll be good. If next week, if we have this meeting, then it's sitting there behind your right shoulder, I'm just going to crack up.
Yeah, okay. Well, you wait next week.
Cool. Well, it's 5 to 9, and I told Kirsty to take about half an hour, so I don't want to keep you too long, Kirsty. You've already been very good. I appreciate your time today. And also, if I'm honest, stepping in at the last minute, I asked you about 11 o'clock yesterday morning. I didn't expect you to put a presentation together, but you've done something else, and I really appreciate it, so thank you. I'm sure the guys are appreciative as well.
Yeah, it was great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cool. So we might have a bit more of a natter and just wrap up with bits and bobs, Kirsty. If you want to just hop off, and if your daughter's not asleep already, you can go and give her a kiss goodnight. And
she's actually in the in-laws, so
oh, she was right.
Crack out wine then.
A glass of wine then, and get yourself down the pub. I know, but I'll see you soon. Oh, she's gone. Great. Oh dear. Great.